You're listening to Inside the Notes. I'm your host, Erica Block. Here we have the opportunity to listen to the stories that connect our musical family tree. First-hand accounts of performances, musicians, and mentors that shape the way we listen, learn, and teach. On today's episode, we welcome British pianist Philip Edward Fisher. Last spring, Philip performed the Shostakovich Second Piano Concerto with the Welcome Symphony Orchestra, and we were lucky enough to have him back for a beautiful recital last night as part of Western Washington University's Samford Hill Piano Series. Was this a program that you've been performing for a while, or do you have different combinations of things depending on the venue?
Well, first of all, great to meet you, Erica, and lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
This particular program from last night was actually a new program for me. It was not so much the pieces were new, but it was a new sort of configuration, or I hadn't done those pieces in that combination before. The second half I'd actually extracted from a program that I did for like lunchtime concerts, for like 45-minute programs with the three Sibelius pieces and the list, the Gargantuan Sonata in B minor. So I'd done that as a smaller program before, and I thought that always worked so well.
Right.
And then just worked in some of these other pieces for the first half to make that work.
Absolutely.
But the whole program itself was actually a new one, yeah. So this was the first time that I'd given it a run out.
How did it feel? Will you do it again?
Definitely, actually, yeah. I liked it. It felt like things worked. Sort of halfway through, I thought this is very intense. Everything on it was a little. I mean, it was such a sophisticated audience. I was struck by how well everyone listened and was involved, and how quiet they were. That's not always the case.
Right.
So I felt like they were sort of lapping it up, and it was by no means too much in that sense. But there was at certain points I thought, maybe I could have thrown in something a little less intense somewhere. But I think it worked. It had a sort of gravitas to it.
That's awesome. The Lieberman, which is a newer piece, is beautiful. I know that you love working with new works. How do you find them, or how did you find that piece?
Yeah, well, I've always played contemporary music, even since I was a kid. I was doing it, 11, 12 years old. Just to backtrack a little bit, one of my first piano teachers in Birmingham, England, introduced me to a Scottish composer called Ronald Stevenson, who was very famous for writing something called the Passacaglio on DSCH, the initials of Shostakovich spelled out on the pitches.
Right.
And it's a sort of 90-minute piano work that just builds and builds. It's incredibly intense. Cool. And he introduced me to that composer. I played some of his stuff. I recorded onto cassette, because we still had cassettes then, believe it or not, I'm showing my age. When he was not well, he said, would I record some of his pieces for him? We sent them to him, and he sent me back this nice letter, and I sort of immediately got a taste, even at that young age, for playing music by living composers, because it was suddenly, I got to meet him, I sat there with him, he told me about the piece, how it was written, how he wanted it to set, and it's like, you're sitting there with a genius writer. You
Absolutely.
feel like you're sitting there with Brahms, or sitting there with, so I think I just sort of got an early taste for playing contemporary stuff, so I'd always done it. When I came to New York in 2001 was when I first moved over to go to Juilliard. I did an exchange from the Royal Academy of Music, and then went on to do my master's at Juilliard. I met a lot of sort of New York-based composers, really brilliant composers like John Corigliano, who I've just toured with his piano concerto, and will be recording it in June with the Albany Symphony.
Wow.
There's a wonderful composer, John Musto, who's an incredible jazz pianist, classical pianist, brilliant composer, and last but not least, Lowell Lieberman, who's one of the preeminent composers, American composers, and I got to know him very well on a personal level, and we were at parties together and would chat, and he's a really fun, cool guy, and he just happens to be kind of a genius when it comes to he's so prolific. I mean, you notice the works I played at Opus 131. I believe he wrote them last year. They're his latest piano works.
Wow.
And I'd seen him at a sort of recent dinner party, mutual friends in New York, and he just happened to be handing the new recording of these works to my friend, and he said, "Oh, these are my latest pianos. I'd love you to hear them." And so I immediately sort of, "Oh, really? Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I'd love to hear them." And I wrote to him, and I got the music, and he said, "I'd love you to play them." And I just fell in love with them.
Wow.
And thought I'd put them on the program. They work particularly well with the late Brahms. He's a huge Brahms fan himself. I think we've talked about Brahms' late style, and I felt like they really perfectly fit in that program.
Absolutely.
So I've just been really lucky to sort of develop these relationships and friendships with composers.
Yeah, it's so fortunate.
Yeah, and it feels so great to play something. I think he's a friend and also a colleague, and I mean, I can send him an email and say, "What do you want me to do in measure 25?" I mean, how often do you get that opportunity?
Absolutely. And it's so fun to kind of have a moment to get inside the head of a composer.
Absolutely.
And probably it helps you interpret composers that you don't get to talk to.
Absolutely.
And what their markings might actually really mean. Because it's so hard to say what you want with dots and lines.
Yeah, exactly.
And
that's a very good point, actually. I recently worked on the piano concerto with John Corigliano, for example, which a piece was written 50 years ago. He wrote it in 1968. So he was 30 when he wrote it. Right. This year was his 80th birthday year. And it struck me when I was playing it for him, there were some things which he just knew how he wanted them. And I think he knew from the moment he wrote it. Right. Then there were other times when it was like, well, we could try this, or I might think about this a little differently from before, or so it gives you that little insight into the process of a composer as well, and not just a performer. Exactly. And I think that does inform the way that you play all music.
Right.
Or think about, as you say, what was a composer's intentions? How might they have been thinking here?
Right.
How do you bring that to life? So it gives you an insight. I think it's one of the most valuable things that you can experience as a performer.
Absolutely.
To seek out, even if it's your contemporaries at a college, the student composers who want to have their pieces played, work with them, because this was always the way in the in the old Brahms
times,
was consulting Joachim about his violin concerto, or Tchaikovsky was consulting Anton Rubinstein about his piano concerto, writing for the instruments. I think there was, in a sense, maybe more appreciation of that collaboration between the composer and performer in those times, and I think it's just very, very important to experience it as a musician,
And like you said, so many times those composers were writing for a specific person, often a friend or a colleague. So it was a true collaboration.
Exactly, and there's often a personal story behind it, or some kind of so to get that insight into why a piece was written, for example, and someone can tell you word of mouth, but then you might say, well, I'll delve into the Beethoven story or Brahms's story, and why did he write this piece at this time? Why is it dedicated to this person?
Right.
Is there a story there that can somehow give me an insight into the meaning of that piece? So I think it definitely informs you in that sense.
So in your time with Corigliano, were there things about the way that he approached the way that he writes? Because his music is so complicated often. So to kind of just first of all get down to the beginning, and how it builds up and all of these different levels that he writes in. How does he kind of sift through all of the notes?
Well, I sort of hate to speak for him because he has a very definitive plan.
Okay. Okay.
I know this. He's spoken about it. I think you can actually see him in lectures and things on YouTube where he talks about his plan. I mean, in as much as I understand it, and I wouldn't want to pretend to know exactly what his method is, but I know that he has, his starting point is almost like a map. So he has almost like a canvas where he maps out the arc of the piece. So he almost knows how it's going to be built before he starts putting in the content. I hope I'm not misquoting it or misrepresenting it.
How you attack working on it.
Yeah, exactly. So I know he has a very defined method. I think he teaches it to his students. He might even work on an ending or something at some point. It's not necessarily always in but what I believe sort of stays the same is that initial map of the piece. So kind of like almost like the way an architect might design a building, and then how is it going to look? What's the interior going to be? What's the exterior going to be? How are these going to sort of coalesce and live together. So I think that's something of his process. And what I notice in his music is he can take a huge form. The piano concerto is 30 minutes long. It's massive. It's 4 movements. It's really in that vein of the romantic piano concerto. But you do get that feel of that sweep of the sort of overall architecture of it. And I'm sure that's partly comes from his that method that he puts into place.
And so how would you approach something like that? Because it is so massive and there's so much responsibility as a pianist that you end up having. You have so many things that you can do. Yeah. How do you work through complicated music like that?
I mean, I always break it down. I find the most important thing is break it down. And in the same way someone might write, I might not necessarily start at the beginning. Right. I might sort of delve into the middle of it. I tend to play things very slowly when I first get them, just to sort of build good habits, to make sure I've got good fingerings. I'm not building bad habits from the beginning, just to sort of get a sense of the overall feel of that piece, and then gradually kind of piece it together and sort of think, well, how do these details fit into that larger structure? That tends to be my way. I especially when you get a big thing which is somewhat intimidating and it's kind of a lot to take in.
Right.
I find it's good just to sometimes just say, okay, well, I'm going to take this section and just work at it, just delve into it, just to sort of dive in and get a taste of it.
Right.
As opposed to kind of
hacking your way through the whole thing.
Right from the beginning to the end and feeling like, oh, wait, I've just got to get through this. You know, I never want to feel that feeling of, oh, I've just got to get through this.
Yes.
I want to sort of dip my toe in and get a feel for it. And I find for me that method tends to work. I think it's a way of almost making something seem more concise when it's actually huge.
Absolutely.
It's kind of like seeing the forest for the trees,
right.
if you know what I mean.
Right, start small.
Yeah.
Get accustomed to the water.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, okay, well that's a perfect kind of segue back to, I'd love to talk a little bit about the beginning, because it sounds like your starting piano to becoming successful was a very short amount of time as a child, very short. So do we have your piano teacher to thank? Was it your parents amazing, making you practice all day, every day? Did it just click for you? How did that initial start happen?
Yeah, interesting. You know, I've only recently really started to think about this, or even really share this story, because it's a little odd in a sense. Music was all around me when I was a kid because my dad taught piano.
Okay.
And I'm the youngest of 7 kids. Each of them, he sort of had them learning piano from the beginning. I think by the time he got to me, number 7, he'd either had enough or just was kind of like, you know...
exhausted.
Yeah, it just didn't... So he never pushed me to learn, ever. In fact, I think one day I just kind of thought, hey, Dad, why did they get to play and I didn't, kind of thing. And I think I was more the one pushing him to give me the lessons. So I actually started quite late, actually. I was about 8.5, maybe 9 years old by the time I really started to play, which is a little different. You know, a lot of the Juilliard students, they were 4 or 5 when they're playing. But I always had music in my head because I would hear him teaching on Saturday mornings, and so it was always there. And then I would say that really for a year or so, I showed little to no talent. Struggled to read music. He was still writing the note names over the notes in like John Thompson Piano Book 1 or 2 or something like that. And I was honestly just very close to quitting. It just didn't seem like it was going to go anywhere. Yeah. I was a little bit frustrated. I think he was a little bit frustrated teaching me, and I had a strange moment where I kind of just thought to myself as a kid, this must be easier than I think it is. This must make sense in some way. And I remember just sort of racking my brain to sort of think about, well, how do you read music? Like, what does it mean? And honestly, it was like a light going off in my head. It was like a light bulb moment where I was like, oh my God, that's how it works. Suddenly I saw this, it made sense that the direction on the page going up was the direction to the right on the keyboard of the piano, and going down it was to the left, and how the notes related to sitting next to each other, how that related to how what you had to play physically on the cue, and it just suddenly just made sense. I was like, oh my god, that's just so obvious now, the system. And I actually went to the music room and I started pulling out Beethoven and Chopin, and I just started reading stuff.
Wow, I bet he was so shocked.
I mean, I think my dad was like almost had a heart attack when I went from John Thompson to that, and I'm sure I was murdering those pieces, but
you were doing it.
But I was doing it, and then you kind of couldn't stop me after that.
Right.
I just wanted to read more and more and more, and I think
That's awesome.
in a strange kind of way, because I don't really know how that happened, and because I jumped these kind of transitions,
right.
It was almost like jumping in the deep end to learn to swim, in a sense.
Right.
It was just like suddenly just start doing it. I think the advantage of that was that I had no kind of hang-ups about it, if you see what I mean. It was just sort of like I happened on this thing, and there was a kind of luck to that, and then I started performing a year later. I was doing recitals.
Wow.
I did my concerto debut at Symphony Hall in Birmingham, which they just built, which Simon Rattle was a driving force behind to get the new hall for the orchestra. I did the Shostakovich second concerto, which I came back to do with Whatcom Symphony. That was the first time since I played it at that debut.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, so that's a whole other story that I can tell you. And there I was suddenly in front of 2,000 people at this, it was like a charity concert for Acorns Children's Hospice. The Duchess of Kent was there.
Wow.
She was a patron of the charity, and I found myself at 12 years old suddenly on the stage with this orchestra playing. I don't think I really even knew what that meant in a way at that age. It was just get out there and do it, and I didn't feel nerves. The nerves kick in as you get older, I think.
The more aware you become of
success
and failure. The more
exactly, and what it really means to you as well to do a good job.
Right.
But so it happened very, very quickly. There was
but you were clearly working really hard, because Shostakovich requires a lot of skill on top of everything else.
I don't think I had the best work ethic as a kid. That came in later.
Wow.
I sort of had an ability to learn things very, very quickly, to memorize very, very quickly, which never, still fortunately, touch wood, hasn't left me to this day. But there's certain disadvantages to that, in that I think I would sort of, I've learned this now, kind of a little blasé, and then how much have you really delved into it? So I think it was later, as I got into my student years, where I started to get much more serious and thinking, well, no, actually I have to really force myself. That's when I started to learn things by playing them very slowly, because I had a sort of habit as a kid just to use any fingers available. I didn't worry about fingers. I didn't. And of course, as you get older, things change. You slow down. The facility isn't the same. You have to adapt your technique as things are constantly changing. Your body's changing. Your muscles are changing. So I think I sort of had to temper that slight attitude I had as a kid of I could just do this. This is and get out there and do it. So it had its advantages and disadvantages, as I think all kind of situations do. But the speed with which it happened was quite.
It's an amazing amount of information to be digested and understood.
Yeah, and as I say, I didn't shy away from the story, but I felt a little bit weird telling it, because it was an unusual story, and then I thought people might not believe me, or they might just think it's kind of, so I sort of just didn't really want to divulge it so much. And then it was really only when people started asking me about, or pointing out the way that you did, saying like from your bio, it's like you started at this age and then you were doing this, like how did that happen
for a little person?
And so I started sort of sharing the story with people, and they say, that's really interesting, you should talk about that more, or you might learn something from that, you might be able to give people advice based on it and all this kind of stuff. So I think I started to shed some of that feeling of kind of being a little bit conservative about the story, and thinking, well, actually, like, why shouldn't I share this story? It's my story, and it has its.
Also really unique and interesting. And I think a lot of people assume if even for themselves, if I wasn't 4 or 3 and completed all Suzuki and already, been concertizing at
Exactly.
6, then I don't have a chance.
Right.
But no.
Well, I always joke,
all these ages.
in England, they have the associated board
Yes.
exams,
Yes.
so the grade 1 to grade
Yes,
8.
yes,
I always
yes.
joke that I don't even have grade 1.
That's awesome.
That was always, I never went
Exactly.
through any of those.
Exactly.
Sort
And
of-
people put a label, like in Canada, it's the Royal Conservatory, it's the
Yeah.
same. So I'm grade 10 piano, I'm
Right.
a AR piano.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean you can't succeed if you
Exactly.
hadn't clicked through every level.
I think that's very true. I think there probably comes a point when you get to a certain age and certain muscles have developed, and ideally you want to have started before that
Right,
age, but
right.
there's no hard and fast rules about
Right.
this. There's no blueprint in the sense.
Right.
And I think I do tend to use that story now to sort of relate that to people. Say, well,
Yeah.
actually, that's not necessarily the case. Something might click for you tomorrow that you didn't even think of today.
Exactly.
Everybody has a different learning process, I think, and a different way of comprehending things and suddenly putting them into context.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a useful story in that sense, to say to people,
Absolutely.
don't feel that you have to have done this by now
Mm-hmm.
or X time to be able to get to the next level. People develop at different stages.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that in teaching and in doing master classes, and things can suddenly click for someone.
Right.
I'm
And
sure as a teacher yourself, you find...
Yeah, and you're looking for ways to help somebody find a way to click.
Yeah.
And I think you asking, even though you were so young, which is also what makes it a really interesting story, the fact that you could sit and reflect and ask yourself, why is this so hard? Why
Right.
isn't this working?
Right.
That is actually the real answer. When you can start asking questions, you can make yourself click.
Exactly,
You can get your own
to
clicks.
embrace the
Yeah, and
the sort of
most
process of it.
9-year-olds aren't asking themselves that question. So that's what makes it such a unique part of your journey.
Yeah, I guess that could be
is
true.
That you
And
were
then
interested and
yeah,
not being force-fed.
yeah,
John Thompson.
right.
You were asking
right.
yourself, wait a minute, okay, this
And
can't
I think
be that bad.
and I think it does teach you in a sense that it's however much teaching you get, however many methods you undertake, however many great teachers give you advice, and of course all of that is needed.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, you are the one who has to do it.
Exactly.
And you're the one who has to live with it, and you're the
Yeah.
one who has to know your method, and you're the one who has to... So I think to be able to have for whatever reason I did, to be able to have the gumption or the confidence to say that at an
Yeah.
early age is really important.
Yeah.
So I mean, I like to, in my teaching, I don't do a lot of teaching. I don't have a position anywhere. I tend to
yeah.
be too busy performing, but I try to have private students, and
Yeah.
I love to do the masterclass situations like this morning. And I think that sort of independent thinking is of the utmost importance.
Absolutely.
Because as a teacher, you don't know what it is that
Right.
drives that person.
Right.
You're part of the exploration process, I think.
Exactly.
You sort of give them
Discovery
the keys.
committee.
Yeah, exactly. You're giving them the keys to unlock it for themselves, but ultimately
Right.
only they will eventually know
Right.
for sure, right? And I
Right.
think when I look back on my own process in that sense, I think that's what it sort of teaches me and
Yeah, that
informs
was your
me if there's
governing
anything I
body,
could pass
was
on.
your
Yeah,
curiosity.
yeah.
So here you are, you click, you get it. Did your dad immediately find you a teacher when you
Yes.
just went bananas all of a
Funny
sudden?
enough, and I give him a lot of credit for this.
Yeah, not
He-
keeping you for himself.
Well, yeah, he sort of was like, okay, I think we have to find you someone else.
Uh-huh.
And I started to play for local people that he knew. He had connections, he
Mm-hmm.
knew local musicians. And I eventually went to take lessons with someone called Philip Martin at the Birmingham Conservatoire, which is now the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire. It just got changed. And he was a wonderful man, also a fantastic composer, great pianist, Irish composer pianist. And he was great for me at that age because he was really personable guy,
Yeah.
lovely person, and I just had real fun in our lessons.
Right.
And he taught me a huge amount, and I think it was just a really good teacher at that time. And then I eventually moved to what was the Intermediate Royal Academy of Music, which was basically you were taking lessons there, even though your schooling was elsewhere.
Right.
So I was traveling down to London once a week
Right.
to take lessons with Christopher Elton, who was the head of keyboard at the Academy for many years, just retired, not as a teacher, but as head of keyboard. and then eventually went to Purcell School of Music to board because it was in London and took me close. So that was sort of the process of finding those different teachers, and I was with Christopher Alton for about 8 years before I eventually moved to New York and found teachers there.
Wow, okay. So you were able to stay with him once you were in the school?
Yes, so I went through Intermediate
through.
Academy, and then when I went to the Royal Academy of Music for my undergrad, I stayed with him, so there was a nice continuity.
That's really nice.
He taught me a huge amount over that 8-year period. We're still friends and keep in contact.
And he was able to get, all your technique, everything was so set already as you were just entering, probably.
Yeah, I think there was a lot that was there, and that there was a lot that he sort of freed up and sort of got me thinking about many aspects of sort of piano technique that I hadn't yet, because, as I said, sort of by happenstance, I sort of jumped a few steps.
Yeah.
So I think there were gaps for sure that needed to be quickly kind of filled and addressed. Cool. But I look back on that period and it's kind of a whirlwind, really.
Yeah.
But I think it taught me a lot about the challenge of it and the commitment needed, which is not to be forgotten.
There is work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, as I talk and hear different stories about how they actually got to college, so much of it, there's a teacher there kind of hiding behind the scenes, guiding it along, or there's always some click moment that propels this person suddenly, like turbo.
Absolutely.
And they go flying to their destination, and it's so much harder if that guidance isn't there and they kind of just fall in and bump their way in.
Right.
It's a different trajectory. It still can happen.
I think that's very true.
The speed is a lot different. So that is a perfect segue to one thing I love to ask everybody is, you're on that journey, all this stuff is happening. I love when you finally get that moment as a listener or as a performer, when you get the electricity and you get the feeling, and especially your first time as a listener. Can you remember a concert that you heard and you left just flabbergasted? You realized you hadn't taken a breath in 20 minutes and just edge of your seat, whoa. And that, I find, often grabs people and just they're single-minded after that. I
can remember it's actually not a concert, it's a rehearsal.
Cool, okay.
Because I grew up in Birmingham, England, and so as I said before, Simon Rattle had recently come to the CBSO and he was changing the whole setup. And he would do these open rehearsals at the town hall, that you could just go along to and sort of watch the process happen. It was incredible. I mean, that was where I heard a lot of my first symphonic music. That was where I heard not necessarily piano music. As a listener, funnily enough, I tend to gravitate towards symphonic music. I don't know if it's just because when I'm listening to piano recitals, I feel like I can't really. I feel like I can't really. I mean, I love to hear other pianists, of course, but there's always that sense of you're so involved in that piece, or you've played it and you almost can't switch off that part of your brain just to sit there and just be like, I'm a listener now, I'm just relaxing. And I remember he was doing very unusual repertoire. He sort of would take the standards, but then he'd pair them with things like the Janacek Sinfonietta or Messiaen Taranga Lila Symphony. And I remember being at the rehearsal for the Messiaen Taranga Lila Symphony, which of course has a huge piano part too, and it has the on Martineau with the weird siren sounds and all these. And I remember just seeing it, just being like, this is just mind-blowing. This is like incredibly exciting music. He was this like young up-and-coming guy with so much energy, and I remember just being struck that this is just like unbelievably exciting. This isn't
captivating.
This isn't just some very high level art which I have to sit here and view from and look at it on a pedestal. I just felt completely involved. I just thought this is just so exciting, and the energy that was coming from the stage. And I think seeing it in the rehearsal setting and seeing the work taking place and then the results of it, that excited me, because I thought actually I kind of want to be a part of that process, not just the result but the actual process as well. So I think that sort of taught me. I think that's when I knew I wanted to be a musician, because I saw those other aspects of it, and was as in a sense, excited just as much as I was by the music.
Right, and there's a journey with that community.
Yeah.
And there's a whole kind of universe that
Absolutely.
as a concert goer you don't necessarily know that it's happening.
Absolutely, and I still, I mean, I love to do solo recitals, but I also love to do chamber music and collaborations, and I love doing concertos with orchestras because you feel that you're part of that, and you can pick out a clarinet solo, for example, in Beethoven or something, and suddenly you become the accompanist for a few measures.
Right.
And then you've got to switch back into the solo mentality. Right. So I love that process of give and take that happens on the stage. Absolutely. With a conductor, other musicians, and the work that goes behind it, but then how the work then enables you to be spontaneous. That's the most fascinating thing.
Absolutely.
To me, because it's almost counterintuitive.
Yeah.
That you have to put in this very almost grinding work to be able to achieve this new level of control that is spontaneous and free, and so that process fascinates me as well. I find that one of the most fascinating aspects of music and performance.
Absolutely. We talk so much about in legato passages, if you can play long enough with the metronome that the metronome stops feeling like a bully pushing you along, and you feel like you've got too much time between clicks. Yeah. If you can build a room big enough for yourself with enough structure that you can wander around in it within the parameters, and all of a sudden there's all this flexibility.
That's amazing. Well, then you realize how relative sort of time is, and because sometimes you might have a feeling that the metronome is slowing down in relation to something you're doing, and then you realize, actually you can almost play around the metronome and still, in a sense, be in sync with it. Yeah. That's kind of a cool feeling, actually. Yeah,
it really is. And I feel like that's next dimension fun. But when you can get in that space, then there's real time and space to
absolutely. I talk a lot with students about slowing down your sense of time. Yeah. Because you can practice something very, very slowly. You slow down your sense of the time that's taking place, and suddenly you're playing something very fast, but it feels slower, or it feels like you have more time in order to do it. So I think that kind of physical freedom that comes from that is also really, really important.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating.
Do you have a concert that you were participating in that you remember specifically, kind of that energy and almost feeling like you don't want to exhale because you don't want it to be over, and you're just so in?
I remember the exact concert, and I actually remember the exact piece I was playing.
Cool.
And I was about 15 or 16 years old, and the Purcell School of Music where I was at the time used to put on these yearly concerts at the South Bank Centre in London. So you would sort of compete or audition to be involved, and say there'd be 4 pianists who would each perform. And so this was at the Purcell Room, which was a smaller sort of recital hall at the South Bank Centre. And I was playing the Chopin Third Sonata, which has the most gorgeous slow movement ever written. And I remember I'd been going through a long sort of discovery process with my teacher at the time, Christopher Alton, about this physical freedom and this almost a sense of slight out-of-body experience of being the performer, but actually hearing what you were producing, almost as a bystander, as though you're slightly object. And he would speak about this a lot, and I sort of always embraced the idea, but sort of, well, what does that really mean? Sort of how do I find that? And it was in that concert, something happened in the slow movement where I felt suddenly this weird feeling like I wasn't in my own body, kind of thing. Like I was almost in the audience observing myself doing it. And it was a very, very overwhelming experience. And I remember that was, oh my God, that was a feeling that I've never had before. Right. Not even speaking technically or what I was doing musically. I felt different. I had a different sensation. And what was interesting was my teacher came backstage afterwards and he said, "You just did it." He was like, that just happened there for the first time. So that was amazing, because that was like a validation of the feeling. Right. So I suddenly realized, I think that made the connection in my brain, because I suddenly thought, oh my God, well, so actually, yes, it came across as well to the listener. Right. Totally respected the fact that he could recognize that, and that was what he was trying to sort of elicit in me. So that stuck with me forever. That piece has stuck with me forever as a result. I love to play it. And I always remember, I almost have kind of a visual imprint of that feeling, if that makes any sense. Like totally. I can almost put myself back there on that stage. I can see the surroundings. I remember the feeling of it, and I can reproduce that. And that's incredible, because this tells you that sort of reflex memory, feeling memory, emotional memory can stay with you for a lifetime almost. And then I take that into teaching too. I talk a lot to young performers about how did that feel just then? Actually, how do you feel physically when you come off stage? Right. Because generally I know if a performance has gone well, not by the details, but just how I feel. Right. When I come off the stage, I have this like almost warm, kind of relaxed feeling in the body. I think, yes, I know I was in the zone. Right. I think it's like that zone that sportsmen talk about, or any kind of performer, where you've unlocked the subconscious. You're no longer in that conscious mind, but you're in your subconscious, and it's kind of doing it for you, and you have that incredible sort of feeling of freedom. So I often just say that if I hear a student achieve something, I immediately say, remember how that just felt. Make an imprint on your brain about what was that feeling, because you can then access that, you can remember that, and go for the feeling sometimes, because the sooner the sooner you get into that zone, it's very powerful for just opening a recital. Say when you're feeling a little cold, you're feeling a little nervous, as we all do. It doesn't matter how many times we do it. You still you still feel like it's the first time you're stepping out on the stage somehow. It never, I don't think that ever goes away.
And that's because of the desire. It's the love and wanting to say something. Yeah. It's so hard at the beginning of a big time to be like, oh, okay.
But for sure now on stage, I go for that feeling. I just I think, well, I know what I want to feel, so I'm going to go for that, as opposed to worrying about every detail that I'm producing at this moment. And I think it's a quick way to get in that zone. Right. Because, and I think you learn this over time, sometimes you think of the zone as something that happens accidentally. Right. Like you can't there's some truth to that. Right. It is something that kind of just, but you do start to learn, well, but why did it suddenly show up at that moment? What mind frame was I in to allow it to show up at that moment? Right. So I think you can remember
the process to get
there. Exactly. And the way to give yourself the best possible chance of it coming along.
You gotta be lined up.
Yeah. So I think there is, I think there are things that you can learn and you build up over time with experience. I remember I used to kind of think, oh, that there's no control over that just happens. Right. And then I started to think, well, no, actually, that doesn't really make sense. There must be a process to kind of understand what that is. Right. And while I don't think you'll ever be able to like produce it on tap, you can certainly give yourself the best chance of getting it. Yeah,
which I think is to understand what things won't get you there. Like if you're obsessing about the articulation of a passage, you're probably not going to get there because you're so zoned in. Exactly. In your conscious mind.
Exactly. So you've got to go for the bigger picture. You've got to go for the feeling. You've got to go for the intention. The overall intention that you want to put across into a hall, and hear it coming back at you and sort of feed off that feedback, and then you have to have the physical freedom in order to sort of let that in. That's awesome. So I think those are all things that can certainly be worked on, and then you don't panic about the fact that, well, it's not always going to be
you're not going to get
the ultimate feeling. There's degrees of it. You might have it 30%, but even that's a good feeling, right? Nice. And when you're lucky enough to get that 100% moment, you just really embrace those. But I think that's all part of the performing process. Giving yourself as many tools as you can, to sort of realize I'm not always going to feel 100%. Some days, you might feel this is like the last place I want to be. That does happen sometimes. You just have that feeling that I don't want to be on stage today. Right. I just have that feeling, but yet I know that once I'm on there, I can step into those shoes and I can visualize all of those past experiences, how that felt, how did I get there, and use that in your armory. You have to accept that it's not a perfect science by any means,
right.
and it's don't expect it to always be fun or pleasant all the time.
Right.
It will be at times. You'll have. I've had the most fun on stage, but I think you sort of have to embrace those ups and downs. To stay sane above everything.
Because the overall trajectory is long.
Yeah.
I mean, part of, I think, the magic of music is that feeling, and versions of that feeling are so beautiful that people want that again, and so often you hear, and then it was 20 years, and then it was 35 years. I can't even believe it. It was a blink.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
It just sends you on the path, but it's not a perfect arc.
You're
bumping along.
Yeah.
But it's really the only place that you can get that, and so once you get it a little bit,
it's a little bit like a drug.
Yeah,
you kind of want it again.
It's like, ooh, that was really good.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, for me, the orchestral energy is what creates that, like, being in that kind of sound with that many people focused on one thing. It's such an overwhelming amount of energy that it's crazy rush.
Absolutely.
And you're like, well, I'm gonna do that again.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I love to play concerti with orchestras, because you feel like you're in the middle of this just swell of energy where everyone's in the same focus, pulling together. It's a pretty powerful feeling. There's not many arenas in life that you can be a part of that.
Yeah.
And there's a certain privilege to that.
Absolutely. And I often wish, for people who don't know about classical music, we struggle with so much of how to get people to give it a try because of all the, stigmas in class and all this stuff, but I wish I could just grab a handful of people and stuff them inside the middle of an orchestra for a rehearsal and be like, just sit here, and it will solve itself.
Exactly.
If you can leave that being like, that was dumb, then it's hopeless. But if you could just sit and feel all of that, it'll grab you.
Absolutely.
You can't not.
Yep.
And then
I think you're
we'll
right.
have people. We need more open rehearsals and more.
Yeah, I really think that's a big thing, and it's great to see that that's happening a lot more. I find that the more and more orchestras I get to perform with have open rehearsals. They have kids coming in, school kids and that was what they were doing in Birmingham when I went with my local just state school that I was at before I went to the music school. They were taking kids in to see these rehearsals, and just to have that experience and to sort of have an insight. Because I think then also you see the musicians joking among themselves, and they're not wearing the bow ties, and they're not, I think you suddenly realize, oh my God, this is a human endeavor above all. And I think just to give it that human touch, and to realize, oh wait, no, I have access to this. This isn't just some, sort of
untouchable $1 million painting.
Exactly.
Do you have artists through your career that you have always listened to or looked to because you love their musical ideas or their tone in any instrument, voice, anything that you just love, and that has kind of shaped some of your thoughts behind how you look at music?
Yeah, I mean, there's some singers that I absolutely love. I mean, I grew up listening to a recording of Tosca with Maria Callas that I just could, a definitive performance of Tito Gobi. Tito Gobi as a baritone, I think, was one of the people that just fascinated me. As a singer, there was something about his tone that was very unusual. It wasn't, you wouldn't say that this is the greatest singing tone,
right?
But he was the most amazing actor with his voice. I literally could sit and listen to him singing in an opera, not speak a word of Italian or German, whatever the language was, and I'd know what was going on just from the way he phrased something, or some tone that he put into his voice. I could understand the context of the conversation that he was having. There's nobody like it. To this day, I listen to him and I just think he was just the greatest actor as an opera star with the voice. I'm not even speaking about having to see him do it,
right? Just
to hear him do it.
Yeah. And
that was kind of an incredible thing, because I think that taught me a lot about intention.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that there has to be intention, and how powerful intention is, and how it can really come across to the listener. Even if it's and I guess it's kind of an actor type of thing, to talk about motivation and all that sort of thing. But I think there's a similarity. I mean, as performers, I feel like we are character actors in a way.
Yeah.
I feel like we have to slip into certain characters. Before you get on stage, if you've got to bring across a certain character in a Beethoven piece, and how do you bring that across to an audience? And it's not always by literally even feeling the thing that you think you need to project. It could be something else entirely. You might have your own method, your own picture, just to inject some notion of intention, because I feel like you need that constantly all along the way. I think when you lose an audience is when you've lost intention.
So true.
It doesn't matter what the intention is as much as just the fact that it's there.
Right. Because I feel like, so if you really think about how they can't see the page, we get so caught in the paper and we see it all and it's all so clear.
Yeah.
And you're just going along doing your thing, but they don't get to see anything, so they only get to hear what's happening and how you deliver all that information so cleanly and succinctly that they can start to see it and understand what's going to happen next, and you lead them
absolutely
the whole way through, so that it's abundantly clear. Because otherwise all the punctuation's gone and they're just hearing a whack of notes. Yeah,
exactly. And I think, and as I said, like I was saying, it sort of doesn't matter what the intention is. So what I mean is you've almost just got to, it's like you're providing them an entryway into that experience, and each audience member might put their own spin on it too. So I don't even think like you necessarily have to say, I'm going to make them feel this, because I'm not sure that's necessarily possible. So, because you're dealing with a bunch of individuals, but you're feeling something. But it's sort of, it's not so much as like trying to impose your reading on them, but just, it's like you're saying, this is my reading. Here it is. A clear picture of it, and then you're kind of allowing them. I always think I used to use an analogy. When you've had a really powerful, meaningful dream that just means everything to you, and then you try to explain it to someone else, and they just look at you like, what? That means literally nothing. I think if you try to be really like try to impose a musical idea to that extent, that it can fall flat. So it just has to be, as you say, a very broad sort of canvas that you're providing for that experience. And I think as long as that intention is always there, that's where the communication sort of comes from.
Yeah, it allows them to see what they want to see in the picture. But you
exactly.
have the whole thing there. It can't be cloudy.
Exactly.
Because otherwise it's boring.
That's it.
I would love to hear a little bit about having been to Royal College of Music and then Juilliard. They're worlds apart. Is the experience similar, or is the U.S. education conservatory classical system really different? How were those two experiences? Was it shocking coming to New York, or was it just another version of the same thing?
A bit of both. I mean, a version of the same thing in some ways, but actually some major differences. Kind of hard to really put my finger on it necessarily. I mean, Juilliard, wonderful school. I was happy to go there as a grad student because I think I had kind of a clear picture of what I wanted to get from the experience. I knew that New York was a place I wanted to be. I wanted to make professional connections. That was my focus. I was sort of, in a sense, seeing the school as a gateway.
Right, to get hooked in.
Yeah, to get hooked in. And it's an incredible place for that. I mean, the people you meet is just unbelievable. Composers, conductors, other instrumentalists, a network of people that I still locked into to this day. I think it's definitely something of a pressure cooker. I think for good, if you're using it to sort of teach you about the industry and about the business. I'm speaking purely for myself. I'm not sure how I would have fared if I went there for undergrad. When I went to Royal Academy of Music, I knew everybody. I knew my teacher. I'd been with him I knew the people on the door. I knew it was
you had a kind of a gentle entry point.
It was almost like a bit of a family kind of atmosphere. It might just be by virtue of the fact that I did the sort of intermediate school and then went into the full college. But I think it's possibly a little less driven in terms of achieving those professional goals. There might at the academy sort of maybe some aspects of it that are nurturing in a way. I think Juilliard gives you a very real insight into the reality of the business, which is valuable, very valuable, and I think it's great for as I say, you know, sort of you've got that clear picture of what you want to achieve. So I think they were two quite different. I wouldn't necessarily want to paint broad strokes, and because I don't. Those are obviously the two schools that I had experiences with, and I think sometimes that can be shaped by your individual experience and where you were at the time. But I think there's a slight, you know, even little things like Europe. There's certain historical things like the building itself is hundreds of years old at the Royal Academy of Music, and even you walk into some of the halls and you realize that, you know, maybe, you know, Ralph Vaughan Williams stepped into here at some point. Maybe Mendelssohn stepped in here at some point. Maybe you talk about sort of the hallowed halls type of thing. I think there's a little bit of that, and you go into just that history that just exists by virtue of the fact that Europe is older.
Exactly.
But then, having said that, you go to somewhere like Juilliard and you realize, oh my God, Samuel Barber was hanging out over there, or, you know. John Corigliano, who's here to, you know, so it's all part of the same kind of journey, the same road, I think. But yeah, they definitely different experiences. I mean, I'm happy to have had the two, because I think it gives you an insight into how things are done in, you know, culturally in the different places.
Absolutely.
And then you feel like you can operate in a way you can.
Yeah, you kind of had a feel of how the whole thing flows.
Gives
you a broader picture. I feel like often here in the States, if you don't have the opportunity to go to Europe, it's a very like singular and specific style. But so much of Europe is so different from each other, of course.
Well, exactly.
And it's such a big place that when you go, I think you get a lot of culture shock going that way. And it's here not popular in the culture. So I feel like in Europe you can be more assimilated into the culture because there's more classical music there. It's pretty insular.
I think that's true. I mean, especially in mainland Europe. I mean, it's true of London, it's true of the UK, but I think it's even more true in mainland Europe. I mean, if you walk around, you know, like certain towns in Italy, and you walk into a church and there's just music everywhere, and there's something happening, and there's, like you say, it's kind of steeped into the culture, so it's kind of around you all the time. Whereas in a place like New York, where there is so much of everything, you have to seek it. Ironically, even though there's so much there, you have to kind of seek it, because it can very easily be diluted by the myriad of things going on. So I think it's a very different cultural experience for sure. I think that's definitely true.
It's fabulous. So how do you plan out your year? Do you get concertos booked and then fill in recitals, and like there's so much preparation when you're dealing with so many different kinds of pieces and things, and exhaustion with travel? Like what's your plan, even if it doesn't always work? What are you looking to do?
I mean, the exhaustion comes from the way things are. You know, you might have a month that's just completely insane, and it's always hard to find the balance, feast or famine type of thing. I mean, it tends, there's the career kind of works on two tracks in a sense, because there's those concerts that are booked far in advance. You know, the Corigliano recording date that I have in June, I've known about for well over a year. You know, a lot of orchestras tend to book farther down the line, and then I sort of have running concurrently a kind of a freelance career also in New York City, where I might get booked for a chamber music concert next month, or I might step in to do something next week. A lot of contemporary things contemporary music festivals, or things that I pick up at short notice, and so there's things that I have running on the back burner that I know I've got to do further down the line. So I'm just sort of maintaining them.
Right.
I'm sort of doing that daily maintenance of just
simmer.
I'm simmering, and then there's the things that suddenly I've got to do something next week, or I've got to learn something very quickly, or someone's written something for me, or I'm doing a lecture, or
Right.
So it's tough in that sense, because I think you got to be ready for the onslaught suddenly, and then you might have a down period where you suddenly feel like you've got to decompress, and that can be hard to deal with in its own way too. Actually, it's not even just the times when you're on the road and you almost don't have time to stop and think. Sometimes it's those moments where suddenly you've got to stop and think that are actually the challenging moments. And I think that's one thing I always say to young people that want to be in the profession, more so than being ready for the up times.
Right.
You got to be ready for those down times, because that's an unusual part of the profession, I feel. Right. If you're going into work every day in the office in the same place, and obviously it has its own pressures, and you're going to be tired, and it's going to be in a different way. As a musician, you're going to have these periods of sort of intense exhaustion and constantly having that adrenaline behind you, because you got to perform next week. So even you've just finished one, and you suddenly you're locked into what you've got coming up next, and there's always that adrenaline running it's like the engine idling in the background. But then suddenly you might have just a period where it's like switch off time, and it's knowing what to do with those times that's tough actually, because you don't want to just sit back and be like, oh, this now just rest on my laurels for a bit. You think, well, how can I be productive with that time? What can I achieve? What can I, and how to balance it. It's tough. It's you have to find your own sort of personal way of staying in shape, staying mentally in shape and physically. I mean, I like to just go swimming, or to use the gym, or to do something physical that isn't my instrument. Just to sort of burn off a bit of energy, just to feel, and also just I think the logistics of traveling a lot. If you feel more physically healthy and shape, then it's less tiring. So I find that I need to keep that routine going.
I always wonder how people deal with the adrenaline, because when it does fire for so long, you get really used to it. And used to dealing and managing with it, because it's also an intense feeling. And then oftentimes when you do have a break, it's the crash. And so like kind of ramping yourself back up for the next one, sometimes those get really hard.
Definitely. And I think sometimes you just you have to just kind of give into the crash for a little bit, and just kind of let it happen, and then pick yourself back up again and say, okay, where do I go from here? It's definitely a balance. But it's an unusual sort of emotional roller coaster. Because I think, when people do say to me, young people, should I get into the business? And so that's the one thing I like to warn them about, because you've got to be ready for that, and just sort of recognize it as a reality, and you find your own ways to deal with that, and to internalize it, and to make sense of it, because it can be very overwhelming, I think.
Absolutely.
If you don't face it and think of how to deal with it, if you just
in the end you're on your own. No one can help you with that.
Absolutely.
That's a big time personal journey, even if you're a soloist or not, and it can get a little rattling. Yeah, absolutely. Very important to have perspective, I think, and not just to think that it's the be all and end all. Not to let it completely take over your life. You need to be dedicated to it, but I like to think that I can also step out of it sometimes and be like, well, who am I otherwise? I'm not just totally, this isn't my only identity. My name has other parts.
I think that's important, because you can get a kind of skewed sense of yourself if you just identify yourself with, well, my next concert and my public image and what people think of me. It can be a strange sort of distorting reality in that way. So I think just to maintain a healthy kind of perspective of, I'm still me.
Right. And I have lots of things which are feeding why I have something to say in my music.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I mean, if you don't live life, what are you going to put into it? What are you going to say exactly?
Other than I'm exhausted and I just played a concert yesterday. Exactly. It sounds a lot like this one. Before we have to go, I really would love to hear your Shostakovich story.
Oh, yes, sure.
First, and then I have one other question for you.
Okay. Yeah, so that story actually, and again, this was a story I sort of hadn't told for a long time, and then it suddenly, the significance of it only really hit me when I got booked by Whatcom Symphony to do the Shostakovich Second Concerto. So it was kind of a funny story. I'd lost contact with Yaniv, and hadn't seen him for a while. Yaniv Attar, the director of the Whatcom, and he suddenly got in contact with me saying, the situation where we'd love to have you come in and play the Shostakovich Second Concerto. Have you ever played it? And I was like, well, funnily enough, that was my concerto debut piece when I was 12, and I literally hadn't played it since. And then weirdly, I got booked by 3 different people to do it in the same time. It was really strange.
The energy was like it's time.
And I don't think there was really much of a connection between them. It just sort of, it was strange. People were suddenly asking to hear it again. I hadn't played it for years. But actually, when I was preparing to play it for my debut, it just so happened that in Birmingham, Maxim Shostakovich, who's the son of Dmitri Shostakovich, happened to be in Birmingham conducting the orchestra. I think he was conducting it. He'd brought an orchestra over from Russia, I think. Somebody, I still don't know who it was. It might have been my dad. It might somebody sort of managed to set up a meeting to meet with him.
Wow.
Play it for him, get the press came in to take photos. And the most amazing thing about this, of course, is that the piece was written for him.
Amazing.
Shostakovich wrote it for his son for his 19th birthday.
Wow.
So it has this youthful quality. That's part of the reason why it has this, slightly more so than a lot of other Shostakovich works, it has this kind of fun, joyous feeling, although great profundity with this beautiful slow movement. Right. And so I think he'd just come out of rehearsal at the Symphony Hall. I went up to the dressing rooms. There I was, this kid.
This little guy.
This little kid. Then I don't think again I fully realized the significance of who I was meeting.
So incredible.
And there was the guy there's a very famous recording with him conducting, and then his son, who's Dmitri, named after the grandfather, playing piano, playing that piece. So it's like the father wrote it for the son who was conducting, and then his son was playing it. It's amazing that that's on the Chandos label. And so there I was, just suddenly playing it for the guy it was written for. And he was just sitting there and said, well, this is what my dad wanted here, and this is, referring to him as referring to Shostakovich as my dad, which just it's awesome. Which had this kind of bizarre quality. And then I think this all just comes back to what we were talking about earlier about playing for living composers, for understanding that human element, that these were people.
These are my dad.
These were somebody's dad, somebody's son, because obviously we sort of hold these great composers of the past with almost like mythological. It's almost like they're mythological. Yeah. Like in some way you don't quite believe they really existed.
Absolutely.
Like the idea that Bach existed, or the idea of like what kind of people were they? Yeah. So, but then just that recent history that you're sitting there with the son of a genius like Shostakovich. Imparting that knowledge
firsthand.
This is what my dad wanted here. Some things which weren't in the score really.
Right, which I feel like is the true gold.
So there we go. We talk about notation not always being exact.
Right.
He said, well, no, he wanted that there actually, but he hadn't necessarily written that there. So that was an incredible story. I sometimes I go back to the newspaper and just look at the photo. I still have the photo. So I sort of started telling that story again.
Good.
When Yaniv booked me for the Shostakovich concerto. It sort of all came flooding back, and so it was quite emotional to go out and play that piece again because I hadn't played it since.
Right.
And
kind of look through it, see the markings. It helps you remember that moment.
Markings that I think Shostakovich's son put in. There were some in the hand where it was like he wanted that there, so it was in his hand. He signed it for me, so I had wrote the personal message on the front. And
that's a piece of history.
Yeah, I still have that score and markings of my teacher at the time. And then actually just having to relearn the piece because I really had to relearn it because I literally still had physical memory of weird, silly fingerings I did when I was 12 years old where I just didn't care. Yeah. And that's amazing again how long that reflex memory lives with you.
It stays forever until you face it.
And I was like, my God, is that what I did when I was that age? And I had to kind
of
relearn
it. And you had little hands and everything was so different.
Exactly, yeah.
Like
So
you have to make do.
Yeah.
And all of his stuff is so big.
So that was pretty fascinating.
That's amazing.
I felt like I was giving a lesson to my 12-year-old self.
Yeah.
Sort of saying, what the hell were you doing there?
Yeah.
So.
In front of Shostakovich.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Amazing. Well, my last question is just a fun one. My colleagues and I are always talking about the sentiment of like, if you perform long enough, everything will happen to you.
Oh,
Do
yeah.
you have any funny moments or things that you witnessed or participated in where chaos ensues, blah 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 happens, and then the concert and no one knows, or the music's gone, or now I have to play it from memory, or the piano's rolling, or just something funny?
I mean, a bunch of little things like that. I could tell you about a recent story where the piano stool collapsed and I ended up on the floor, but I won't get into that. I think one that really sticks in my mind, because every pianist will identify with this.
Okay.
That when you're on the road, you never know what instrument you're going to get.
Exactly.
This is the thing about being a pianist, unless you're taking pianos around with you. Yeah, exactly. Generally, we just make do with what we get, and so you come across beautiful pianos. The one here at this Performing Arts Centre is a beautiful Steinway. It's just a pleasure to play. Sometimes you go to smaller venues and
it's harder.
Not so great. There might be keys sticking that you got to address, or there might be notes that jump out. The regulation's not perfect. It's all these you've got to learn quickly. You got to. It's almost like driving a new car.
Right.
Like you got to learn very quickly.
Yeah.
That I need to put this amount of pressure to produce this sound.
Right.
So you're constantly sort of learning these. But this was a particular story where I was touring with a violinist by the name of Elmar Oliveira, who's a brilliant American violinist who won the Tchaikovsky competition on the violin in Russia, similar to almost like the Clyburn story.
Yeah.
He was the American that went and won the Tchaikovsky competition, and incredible player. Really got along with this guy, and I traveled down to Arkansas to play a recital with him. I believe it was at a university or something, and so we're coming into the rehearsal. We've just arrived. I remember I had a really bad cold and I'd had to travel, so I was already just feeling kind of we came in for the first rehearsal. Elmar's like warming up with his back to the piano. I get to the piano. I'm like looking at it. I wonder what this instrument's going to be like. The lid to the keyboard was closed, and I lifted up the keyboard lid, and I turned to Elmar and I was like, Elmar, we have a slight issue here. There was no keyboard in this piano. The entire thing was just missing. The entire action was just not there.
Oh my God.
And Elmar turns around, thinking, there's going to be a key sticking, there's going to be and he just looks, double take. And there it was. I'd never had that before. Turned out that the piano technician had taken the action home to work on.
Oh my God.
Like the following day, lived like an hour away. And there we were. This was our only rehearsal slot. We had one rehearsal slot, and we had to find another. There was another classroom open with some beat up old piano, and we rehearsed in there.
Oh my God.
And it literally wasn't until the following day, the day of the concert, where I got like 10 minutes on this piano when the action has finally been brought back, and then quickly get used to it and then get out there and play the concert.
Gosh.
So I think that's
awesome.
That was pretty special.
Like, no keys. That's the worst.
That was like, I've seen it all now.
Just a piece of furniture waiting for me.
Exactly. An empty shell. So that was...
Yeah, it really
I don't think I was laughing at the time, but
no,
I definitely laugh about it now when I look back on it.
Oh my gosh, that's hysterical. Thank you so much. This
was
was
a pleasure.
Fabulous. It was so great to hear your stories.
Thank you for having me.
Very grateful. Thanks for listening to Inside the Notes. I'm your host, Erica Block. Be sure to check the Inside the Notes Facebook page for details on our next guest.